I'm about to sculpt 100 heads in Blender. I journal every single day of my journey, so you'll get to hear the thoughts of an artist who all his life has been running away from anatomy. By the end of this video, we'll find out how much I improve or if I even improve at all. I want to first acknowledge Ahmed Aldoori's 100 heads in 10 days challenge that already exists in the 2D art community, but if you think I'm gonna finish this in 10 days, then congratulations, we shared the same toxic trait. Anyway, this is a character that I did 2 years ago, and it was probably the first character that I ever sculpted from scratch in Blender. Early last year, I decided to actually start making character-centric art pieces, and later that year, tinynocky was born. I started making more and more characters and started seeing some improvement, but there was one thing I avoided like the plague: anatomy. Yeah, so for the longest time, I managed to get away with it solely by observing the shapes and planes, and also by covering up the flaws with hair and accessories. Not the best. Before I began a challenge, I needed a goal. I didn't exactly know where to start, but I know that whenever I sculpt heads, I'm always second guessing myself. So I noted down some weak points that I felt I needed to address, and without further ado, let's begin a challenge. Day 1. To test my current skill level, I've decided to sculpt 3 heads with soft and feminine features. I believe they're arguably the hardest to sculpt, so I knew this would make a good before and after. So for the first head, I freestyled a female head without any reference at all to the best of my abilities. I know, it's not the most pleasant sight to see. Just for good measure, here's what it looks like without the hair. Before I move on to the second head, I wanted to take a step back and do some reflection, so here's a clip of me reflecting. So after looking at some references, I feel that my weak point is pretty much the entire face, but if I had to nitpick, it would be the eyelids, or in general, the placement of the orbital muscles and fat. I was trying to go for double eyelids, but I ended up with this triple eyelids thing. I know that there's some form of fat that is supposed to be here, but off the top of my head, this was the best that I could do. Also, the nose is something that I'm super weak at. I don't quite know the anatomy of a nose. I wasn't confident enough to sculpt in the lines that separates the wings from the nose bridge, so it kind of looks like a blob that is trying to look like a nose. It lacks a lot of planar information. The chin region, I'm kind of weak at too. The ears, I don't quite know how ears should look like off the top of my head. This is my attempt at trying to recreate the Disney style ear. Okay, so basically everything. Next, I attempted to sculpt a popular South Korean artist, Taeyeon. I already knew that it was not going to turn out well. She seemed really hard to sculpt, and I know well enough where my skill level was, and yep. So at this point in time, I felt that everything was so fragile. Correcting one part of the face seems to create more problems. I tried covering portions of her face to isolate a region and tried to match the likeness as closely as possible, but I felt that no matter how much time I spent on this sculpt, it just wouldn't turn out well. Lastly, just for good measure, I sculpted a chibi version of Taeyeon. I tried to stay away from the current look that I've been doing, not because I hate how they looked. I just wanted to explore and possibly expand my skill. Oof. I noted down in my journal the parts I felt were the toughest to capture. That way I would know what to prioritize in my next session. After committing the hideous crime of birthing these 3 hits, I refused to continue the challenge without more knowledge, so I took up a course by SpeedChar, who I've learned a lot prior to this challenge just by observing his live streams. Day 2. I sculpted about 5 hits in a course, which I won't include in a head count, but in the course we studied the planes of the skull, sculpted a real skull, made a head over the skull, blah blah blah. It kinda gave me a slight understanding of how the face interacts with the skull, but then I hit a roadblock. My brain just stopped soaking in information. I guess I had too many unanswered questions. Day 3. In a PureRef file that came in the course, I found 2 references that I felt were digestible given my current level of knowledge. This male bust by Yeong Kim and these planes of the skull by Gusztav Velicsek. I'm sorry if I butchered their names. Later found out that they had even more references on their pages, so I threw them into Photoshop, made some tweaks for better readability, then threw them into a PureRef file. Then I decided that I want to master this male bust before moving on to anything else. I began sculpting, blatantly referencing and observing the planes. I titled this stage of my journal as Observation, so I would observe the reference, then sculpt until I don't know how to progress anymore, then observe the reference again, and repeat. Without realizing at this point in time, I started subconsciously noticing certain landmarks of the face, such as the angle of the cheekbones, the supraorbital margin, which at the time I believe I called it the angry bone because it looked like a frown. At this point in time, I wasn't memorizing the anatomy terms, I just viewed them in in generic terms like cheekbones, neck muscles, nose bridge, etc. I even drew over the sculpt with the annotation tool while observing the reference to identify the planes of the face. I proceeded to do this 2 more times and started getting more comfortable with this workflow. Day 4. I sculpted the same male bust, this time without any reference. I was basically practicing active recall, where you would first study the material, then put it away and force yourself to remember it before comparing your results with the material. I found it really hard to get the lips right. Despite practicing on some spheres, I still couldn't really establish a proper workflow to get it right. They would always start off looking very pouty, then I would have to aimlessly try to make it not look pouty. I decided to move on anyway and sculpted the male bust 2 more times, and I felt pretty happy with my progress so far. Day 5. I did another round of active recall of the same male bust and started feeling ambitious, so I decided to sculpt Henry Cavill. Yeah, this one took a little longer than usual, but I was pretty happy with the results. This sculpt definitely gave me a nice little dopamine boost and confidence needed to continue this challenge. Perhaps his eyes were sculpted a little too far apart, but compared to this sculpt of Sova, which I did last year and was supposed to be a direct reference of Henry Cavill, I think I've come a pretty long way. Day 6. I felt pumped and ready to move on to the female bust, but before I did that, I did another 2 rounds of the male bust, one being observation and the other being active recall. Afterwards, I proceeded to do 3 rounds of observation of the female bust, and I took note of the subtle differences in things like the angle of the jaw and the prominence of the supraorbitals, the brow ridge, nose, etc. However, by the end of the day, I started to feel like I was just going through the motions. I felt the urge to clear as many heads as I could just to meet the quota, and on top of that, to be transparent with you, I wanted to put out this video that you're watching right now much sooner than I have for that YouTube money, but I decided to stay on track and be more effective with my learning journey. Day 7. I did another 2 rounds of observation of the female bust. I realized that I had trouble placing the eye sockets and the eye region in general, so I spent most of the time on the second bust to clear some doubts. Day 8. Again, I did another 2 rounds of observation of the female bust. However, my hands were itching to sculpt real people, and I already had decided that I was gonna sculpt a male character first, so I ditched the active recall session of the female bust and instead did 1 round of active recall of the male bust, and with full excitement and confidence, I decided to sculpt the Weeknd. His facial features seemed fairly prominent and easy to capture, but the more I sculpted, the more it started looking like the weekday. Let me catch you making that joke again. Let me catch you making that joke again. I'm not. So I had to put the pen down for the night. Day 9. Feeling a little gutted from the previous sculpt, I attempted to sculpt the Weeknd again. I was pretty happy with how it was turning out at first, but it turned out alright. Definitely could be better, but I had to move on. So I decided to sculpt Joey from Friends, and honestly, I wasn't too mad about it. Didn't think I did as well as I did with Henry Cavill, but I thought maybe because Henry Cavill had such strong features that they were easier to identify, so I tried not to be too hard on myself. Day 10. I did a session of observation of the male bust as a refresher, then I proceeded to sculpt Chandler from Friends. 50 minutes in and I just wasn't feeling it. I just couldn't get the eyes right, so I decided to restart from 0, this time inserting the eyes in the early stage. The eyes still looked a little weird to me at this point. I still couldn't figure out why, but yeah, this is how it turned out. Definitely one of the tougher ones to sculpt, but overall I'm not too mad about it. Day 11. I decided to freestyle ahead as a form of warm-up just to get in a groove, but it ended up being really fun, and it also gave me some perspective of how to manipulate the face, so I decided to do it 2 more times, really letting myself go, and ended up with these interesting results. Then I did another observation and active recall session of the male bust. Day 12. I gave myself a list of face shapes to freestyle from, and I have to do it for both male and female. First one being a rounded face type. I ended up emphasizing on the nasolabial folds and saggy jowls, implying that they're old. Second one being a blocky face type. I decided to lengthen a jaw and emphasize on the masseter. I also gave them a really blocky nose. The female one turned out really weird and creepy, but anyway. The last one being an evil face type, so naturally I gravitated towards pointy features. I elongated the body of the mandible. I made the helix of the ear pointy, and again at this point in time I still haven't had any of the anatomical terms memorized. Also, you can see that I was still very much influenced by the bust of Yeong Kim. So day 13. After another round of active recall as warm-up, I decided to observe YanSculpts YanSculpts' approach of sculpting faces in hopes of toning down the influence of the male bust, after which I freestyled a regular male face and it kinda worked. The distinct zygomatic bone, masseter, and nose were no longer as pronounced. Then I decided that it was time to sculpt real faces again. So I sculpted Ross from Friends, and at this point in time, I was pretty happy with how it turned out. In hindsight, the transition from the nasolabial fold to the modulus is too harsh, but yet it lacks depth. But I was happy, so I did another round of observation of the female bust before sculpting Rachel from Friends. I was kinda nervous at this point, considering that it was the first real-life female that I was about to sculpt ever since the birth of my 3-lab experiment. At first, I couldn't get her very recognizable lips right, but after a ton of tweaking, I was so happy with how it turned out, it definitely gave me a dopamine boost. Day 14, it was time to sculpt Monica, also from Friends. This time with a little twist. I decided to sculpt her smiling, and it definitely threw me off. I didn't like how it turned out at all, and I thought maybe because it was my first time sculpting a realistic smile. Then I decided to subscribe to YanSculpts' Patreon for a month and got to see him sculpt Mel from Arcane to observe his workflow and to just soak in more information. It gave me an insight on how to approach sculpting eyes better. So I proceeded on to sculpt Phoebe, again from Friends, and I gave her a smile too. I really liked how this one turned out. The landmarks were really clear and readable. Plus, I took much less time with this one, so I thought, okay, let's give Monica another go. So I attempted Monica once again, and yeah, maybe Monica is just too difficult to sculpt. I think it's better than the first attempt, but maybe it's the copium. Anyway, day 15, it's time to move on to stylized characters. I have a few characters from Encanto in line, each of which I will sculpt 4 different expressions. I started off with Abuela Alma because I liked her prominent features. The silhouette of her profile, her nose, her tear bag, her jowl really piqued my interest. Once I was done with the aesthetic pose, I duplicated it and began sculpting the other expressions. I realized that you could just visualize how she would emote with a facial rig and just sculpt accordingly. I definitely gained some perspective from this exercise. I learned to identify the bony areas and avoid messing up the forms. I learned to pinpoint the inner and outer parts of the eyes to identify the angle of the eyes. At this point, I thought, ooh, Disney characters seem pretty easy to sculpt. We'll see about that. Day 16. I sculpted Mirabelle, same thing, 4 different expressions. I realized that I became less afraid of the lasso mask. I used to fear the blemishes that it leaves behind because then you would have to smooth it out, and you know how smoothing it out could destroy the forms. But not so much anymore. I'm more confident now that I could just sculpt the forms back in. Day 17. It's time to sculpt Dolores. This time I wanted to try sculpting the eyelids and ears separately. Sculpting the ears separately turned out to be more effective and flexible than I thought it was going to be, so it's definitely going to my tool belt. The separate eyelids, on the other hand, turned out to be more of a hindrance, so never again. Remember when I said Disney characters seem pretty easy to sculpt? Well, this is where I got my ass whooped and humbled. Her features were really soft and I had a really hard time pleasing them. Good time. Day 18. It was time to sculpt Bruno. This time, I decided to sculpt the neck separate from the head. Again, this turned out to be more effective and flexible than I thought it was gonna be, but in hindsight, this approach is slightly slower than the usual pulling from the head method. However, it's a tool that's worth going into my tool belt. While sculpting Bruno, I had a little epiphany that the bottom of the zygomatic bone is aligned with the bottom of the nose. Also, the surface between the bottom eyelid and the top part of the zygomatic bone is actually quite large. Anyway, Bruno was extremely fun to sculpt. I noted down that my weak points were the placement of the cheekbones and the tear bag. So to address these weak points, I watched some of SpeedChar's live streams and YanSculpts' Patreon video and observed how they approached them. Afterwards, I decided to sculpt this character by SamDoesArts. The last time I sculpted one of his characters, it didn't turn out the best, so naturally I was pretty nervous. I wondered if the Disney characters would hinder my ability to sculpt characters with slightly more realistic features. I was also really worried that it was not gonna work out because I initially only referred to this one portrait, but I ended up cross-referencing another portrait of his, and I was really relieved and happy with the results. Day 19. I sculpted 2 more of his characters, one being the cross-reference and the other being one of his OCs, Kara. I relied on landmarks such as the angle of the jaw, how far out the profile of their lips and nose are, the size of their eyes, the distance apart, and the size of the neck relative to the head. I think I should remind you that at this point in time, I still haven't had any of the anatomy terms memorized, maybe except for sternocleidomastoid.
Sternocleidomastoid. the best muscle in the human body, we all know.
Yeah. Anyway, while sculpting Kara, I finally figured out how to place the eyes more effectively. I would sculpt in the cavity and focus on the placement of the upper eyelids, then insert the eyes before filling the lower eyelids. This trick worked for the most part, but at this point in time, I still wasn't sure why. Anyway, I'm seeing things now that I'd really love to fix, but I was really happy with how they all turned out. Now it's time to move on to a different style, and this time I decided to study the works of Riot. I was pretty intimidated by their characters, but I figured that I should start with what looked the toughest to sculpt, and that for me was Silco from Arcane. 30 minutes in and I already hated how it was turning out, so I took a step back, shook it off, and decided to restart. I knew that this was gonna be hard, so I wasn't too bummed about it. This time, I sculpted the head separate from the neck and just hoped for the best. There are so many details on his face, I had a really hard time placing his features, but I ended up really enjoying sculpting his face and was pretty happy with how it turned out. Day 20, it was time to sculpt Jinx, also from Arcane. I figured that it would be an easier task compared to Silco, so I was pretty excited. About 1 hour in and that doesn't look anything like Jinx. I was a little discouraged, not gonna lie, considering that this was hit number 65. I decided to count it as a hit anyway and try again and again and again. And I couldn't do it. I didn't know why. I tried really hard to place the side planes and the front planes. I tried matching her face in every single angle, but it feels like day 1 again, where one little tweak would break the sculpt. So yeah, I felt defeated. I took the weekend off to reset, but I was worried. Are my skills going to deteriorate from the 2 days break? I don't know. Day 23. YanSculpts had just released a new course on sculpting heads, so I decided to purchase the ultimate version, went through the videos, and things started clicking again. And the course clarified more questions that I had. For example, the upper eyelids should be more forward than the lower eyelids. Like, this information alone was such a huge breakthrough for me, and I could confirm that the temple is in fact where the tail of the brow is. So I decided to freestyle a male bust, but halfway through it, I suddenly had the urge to sculpt Pedro Pascal. This time, I was much more patient and delicate with the sculpt. At this point, I decided to use the eye region as a point of reference and sculpt the remaining features accordingly. This made capturing the likeness a lot easier and less fragile. Also, I realized that I could suddenly remember some of the anatomical terms of the face, not that it matters, but being able to break down parts of the face into smaller groups and label them is really helpful. So taking a break turned out to be a really good decision, and I was extremely happy with how this sculpt turned out. Such a nice way to get the ball rolling again. Day 24. I continued watching YanSculpts' course, this time tackling the ears, and I accompanied the course with the book I wish I stumbled upon since the very beginning, Anatomy for Sculptors, specifically the book on the form of the head and neck. I honestly cannot recommend this book enough. Anyway, something that I've always struggled with was sculpting the back of the ear. I know it's oddly specific, but it's an area I often overlook. I realized that the back of the ear is literally the concha of the ear, and that means it really shouldn't be that thick. Go ahead and pinch the insides of the ears and notice how they're only about as thick as the wings of your nose. After the much needed confidence boost, I decided to tackle Jinx again. This time I told myself that I wasn't gonna be hard on myself if it doesn't turn out well. And it didn't turn out the best, but I was satisfied enough to move on from this sculpt. I decided to move on to characters from Valorant, and for this case, I chose to sculpt Phoenix from the cinematics instead of the in-game model. I wanted to start off with a character with more prominent features. I didn't do his locks because they were very time consuming to do, so instead I sculpted a silhouette of his hair and was satisfied, so I moved on to Sage, again from the cinematics, not the in-game model. I was worried that I was gonna butcher it, especially after that traumatic Jinx experience, but I thought it turned out pretty good, almost to a point where I feel I did Phoenix a little dirty. So day 25, I decided to give Phoenix another shot, this time giving him the locks that he deserved. It did take a little longer, but by the end of it, I was really glad that I gave him another shot. I finished the day with 2 more Valorant characters, both again from the cinematics. First one being Deadlock, which I think turned out okay, and Neon, which I think turned out pretty great. This day felt pretty productive, and I was getting back in a groove. Day 26. I was inspired by the second version of Phoenix that I just sculpted, and I had the urge to resculpt some of the earlier characters that I thought could be improved. I started with the Weeknd, and I really made sure to get the eyes right and sculpt the other features according to it. Oh, and something I noticed, I finally broke out of the Yeong Kim male bust habit that I developed and instead use it as a visual guide. The Yeong Kim male bust have some prominent angle changes that I personally find really useful to remember, and that for me is the zygomatic bones, the masseter, and the line that goes from the nasolabial folds to the chin. Once I was done with the Weeknd sculpt, I put it beside the first version and I was shocked at how ugly the first one looked. Well, I guess it's subjective, but I think objectively, if we're solely talking about the likeness and the resemblance of the weekend, I think the second one is much closer. In fact, if we're talking from a stylized standpoint, I kinda prefer the sculpt I did before New Year's that was solely done just by observing the reference, but I think setting the eyes as a point of reference was a really good idea, and it's safe to say that it will be part of my workflow now. Feeling ecstatic, I decided to resculpt Joey. Now, if you put them side by side, despite the fact that the second version looks more anatomically correct, I think I captured the likeness of Joey better with the first version, especially the eyes, but I wasn't too mad about it. Plus, I think it helps knowing that I completed the sculpt 40 minutes quicker than I did with the first one. Day 27. I decided to start the day with a freestyle planes of the male face, which essentially turned out to be just another active recall session of this Yeong Kim's male bust. This was just a quick little refresher before resculpting Chandler. Chandler was one of the tougher ones to sculpt, so I wasn't expecting too much, and yeah, it turned out a little weird, but once again, the second version looks more anatomically correct, but the likeness of the first one seems closer. Maybe it's the hair or the shape of the face. Either way, I wasn't too mad about it. But I did feel that I jumped to a high poly count way too early, ended up at about 500,000 faces, excluding the ears and the neck. So I tasked myself to not exceed 300,000 faces, including the ears and neck for the next sculpt, hoping that I will achieve the likeness at a much lower poly count. So I decided to sculpt Ross next and gave him his iconic mouth opened blank face. I tried my hardest to achieve the likeness while keeping the poly count as low as possible, and I was really surprised to see the likeness start to appear at only 40,000 faces, including his ears and neck, before remeshing it to about 120,000 faces just to refine his features a little bit. I was really happy with how this turned out. Day 28. Feeling a little encouraged, I decided to give Chandler another shot, but before I did that, I did a quick freestyle of the male bust without any reference, just as a quick little warm-up. Then it was go time. Again, I tried my best to achieve the likeness at the lowest number of faces possible, so including the neck and the ears, I ended up with about 120,000 faces, but I'm not necessarily very happy with how it turned out. I guess it's just currently out of my league to sculpt. However, I'm glad that I could at least finish this sculpt in about an hour less than version 2, so I'll take that. Also, it was during this sculpt that I found out in this amazing book that our eyes aren't completely parallel due to this thing called the angle kappa. That is the angle between the visual axis and the pupillary axis. There's more to this, but all of this is to say that our eyes bow out at around 5 degrees when looking at an infinite distance. Anyway, I freestyled a female bust, again without any reference. This was just a quick warm-up before sculpting Monica. Monica was also one of the tougher ones to sculpt, so again, I wasn't expecting too much. About an hour in, I thought it looked pretty promising. I thought that maybe this was finally the time I break through, but then I threw the hair on and it suddenly didn't look like Monica, so I proceeded to tweak the face even more and eventually ended up with this. Maybe Monica is just another character that is currently out of my league to sculpt. For some reason, they look more like the characters without the hair than with it. So after all, maybe it's the hair that's bad. I don't know, that would take too much time to find out. So day 29, I wanted to explore chibifying some of the characters that I've sculpted during this challenge, so I decided to study the adult skull, once again with the guidance of SpeedChar's course that I mentioned in day 2, and this is what I ended up with. Then I found these toddler skull references and basically morphed the adult skull into a toddler skull and noted down the differences of the measurements, and this is what I got. Pause the video if you want to read it. Then I sculpted over the skulls and gave them a face. The adult skull with more prominent features and the toddler skull with softer features. Once I was done, I was curious to see how it would turn out if I gave the toddler skull adult-like features instead of the usual bean-shaped face that I normally gravitate towards. I thought that maybe this could be a style that I could explore if it turned out well. I tried my best to sculpt it to resemble the adult version, and this is how it turned out. Not gonna lie, it looks a little weird, can very easily get creepy, but I wasn't ready to give it up yet. Day 30. Before I carried on with the smallifying of the adult face, I decided to sculpt Antonio Madrigal from Encanto just to get an idea of how Disney interprets younger characters. And I was really happy with how this turned out. If you compare adult Mirabelle to her younger self, the rules pretty much checks out. Taller forehead, taller eye sockets, shorter nose, shorter maxilla, and shorter mandible. Day 31 and 32. I pretty much just smallified a bunch of characters I had sculpted previously, like Pedro Pascal, The Weeknd, Ross, Joey, Rachel, Abuela Elma, and Bruno. The fact that I had to capture the likeness of the adult features while fitting them onto a toddler muscular skull made it a really interesting exercise. It forced me to carefully identify which part of each character's face makes them who they are. As of now, I personally think that the silhouette of the face and the eyes play the biggest roles. Anyway, this is how they turned out. I still don't quite know how I feel about this. After the smallifying process, I wanted to see if it hindered my ability to sculpt regular faces, so I sculpted another SamDoesArts portrait just as a little test, and at this point, I kinda can't afford to fail considering that this is hit number 97. Although it did feel a little weird sculpting in this proportion again, thankfully it didn't hinder anything and it turned out okay. Now, all there's left to do is to sculpt these 3 heads again and see how much I have improved. So I'm gonna sculpt these 2 heads first before I sculpt this one. So while I sculpt the 2 heads, let me give you my thoughts on the course and resources that I used during this challenge. First of all, the Head Anatomy and Sculpting Exercises course by SpeedChar. As a fresh anatomy newbie, in my opinion, this course is not the most beginner friendly, but instead, I'd recommend this course to early intermediate users who wants to polish their head anatomy knowledge and improve the speed of their workflow by observing his approach. He does drop a lot of golden nuggets throughout the course, and the better I got, the more useful the course became. I especially like the portion of the course where he sculpts over beginner submissions to address their mistakes. If you have seen one of his content or live streams, you'd know that he's known for his insane speed and humor. If you're tight on cash, some courses on Udemy tend to go on sale, including his. If not, be sure to check out his ArtStation to see if his courses are cheaper on there. Plus, artists get to keep 95% of their earnings on ArtStation, so you'd definitely be doing him a favor there. Second of all, Master Sculpting Heads by YanSculpts. This course is beginner friendly. The walkthroughs that come with the basic version definitely answered some of my questions, so I'd say it's more than enough to get you started. This course comes with plenty, and I mean plenty of references, ranging from screenshots in PureF files to blend files with detailed models that have been meticulously labeled. The ultimate version to me is optional, but it does dive into specific features like the eyes, nose, mouth, and ears, which has helped me clear some doubts that I had. It also comes with free future upgrades and chapters. In fact, while I was working on this video, he released an additional 4 hours worth of content which I have yet to check out. It's safe to say that you'll get your money's worth, but if you can't afford the ultimate version, I'd happily recommend the basic version. Anyway, this is how it turned out. As you probably saw, I struggled really hard with the hair, but overall, I'm really happy with the results, and I think it's safe to say that I improved. If you disagree, let me know in the comments down below. Last of all, Anatomy for Sculptors. This, to me, is a must-have for visual learners. It is packed with invaluable information and can even be found in the workspaces of industry professionals from companies such as Riot Games and more. If I could do this challenge all over again, I would personally buy their book on the form of the head and neck before starting this challenge or buying any courses. I say that because ever since I knew of them, they've been serving as a great cross-reference to the courses that I mentioned earlier, you know, as if they're textbooks. I started off by solely relying on their content that were generously provided on your ArtStation and putting them together in a PureF file. I milked this free alternative until I was itching for more information on, I believe, the neck. Eventually, I bought their ebook bundle. On their webpage as of today, there would eventually be a pop-up prompting you to sign up for their newsletter in exchange for a 10% discount code. I believe if it's your first time checking out, you also get a 10% discount code on checkout. No, these discount codes do not stack up, just in case you're wondering. And just a personal observation, they seem to have a streak on these holiday sales. Maybe they'll have one this year too. I don't know, make of it what you will. So if you're tight on cash, make sure to keep a lookout on these great deals. If you do get the book, I have an affiliated link in the description, and before you roll your eyes, I do genuinely go by everything I said about this book. Plus, for no additional cost, you'll get to support this channel. So if you do get it through my link, I'd like to thank you for the support. So this is how the smallified Taeyeon turned out. Again, I called it smallified because it's a chibi with adult features and I don't know what else to call it. Here's what they look like side by side without the hair. I think the after not only resembles Taeyeon more, but I think it turned out much less creepy. As you guys may have noticed, her hair looks a little different. That's because I referred to a different reference picture. Oh, and by the way, the hair is copied and pasted from the adult version that I'm about to sculpt. So yeah, those are my thoughts on the resources that I used, and without further ado, let's sculpt the final head. If you guys made it this far, thank you guys so much for watching. Ever since I finished this challenge, I've been doing a little bit of practice behind the scenes in hopes of improving. I even re-sculpted Jinx again. But yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Consider subscribing and watch this video next if you want to watch me take 18 days to animate a 5 seconds animation. Bye guys.